billionaire CEO finds a poor girl at his own mother's grave, only to freeze at what she says. Before the story begins, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The crisp autumn leaves crunched beneath Jonathan Sterling's polished Italian leather shoes as he walked the winding path through Oakwood Cemetery. The air carried the scent of damp earth and fading chrysanthemums, the same fragrance that had greeted him for the past 10 years on this very day. At 43, Jonathan was the embodiment of power and success, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with salt and pepper hairs that gave him an air of distinguished authority. As the CEO of Sterling Global, an international financial empire that shaped markets and dictated economic tides, he was a man used to command. Yet today, there were no boardrooms, no billion-dollar deals, no sharp suits tailored to exude dominance. Today, he was simply a son mourning his mother. It had been a decade since Eleanor Sterling took her last breath, leaving behind a void that neither wealth nor power could fill. She had been his anchor, the only person who had ever seen beyond his ambition, beyond the hard edges he had sharpened to survive in the ruthless world of finance. Where others saw Jonathan Sterling, the visionary tycoon, she had only ever seen her boy, the child who had once clung to her hand on stormy nights, who had built castles from wooden blocks on their living room floor, who had believed that love was the most valuable currency in the world. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that lesson. Jonathan's throat tightened as he approached the headstone. 10 years, Mom, he whispered, his voice rasping with the weight of time. The monument was understated but elegant. Polished marble, clean lines, a single inscription carved with precision, Eleanor Sterling, 1950-2013. The measure of success is not what you gain, but what you give. The words made his chest ache, as they did every year. He crouched, placing a bouquet of white lilies at the base of the stone, her favorite. The delicate petals stood in stark contrast to his hardened exterior, a silent offering from a man who had spent years chasing the world's idea of success but had failed to honor the one promise that had mattered most. A gust of wind stirred the leaves, carrying an eerie stillness across the cemetery. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled on the other side of his mother's grave. Jonathan frowned. He had never encountered another visitor here. This was always his moment, his ritual, his private grief. And yet, there she was, a little girl, no older than 7, her tangled auburn hair whipping around her face in the autumn breeze. She was wearing a faded blue dress, the fabric worn thin at the sleeves, and a pair of scuffed canvas shoes that had seen far better days. In her tiny hands, she held a single wildflower, a stark contrast to his expensive bouquet, yet placed beside it with just as much care. Something about the scene unsettled him. "Hello," he said cautiously, his deep voice cutting through the silence. The girl looked up, and Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes, large, deep brown, filled with a quiet wisdom far beyond her years. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much, the kind that carried stories they should not yet have to tell. For a moment, she simply studied him, as if she had been expecting him. Then she spoke. "You're her son." Not a question, a statement. Jonathan's frown deepened. "Yes, I am." His voice came out rougher than intended. Did you know my mother?" The little girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she lowered her gaze, smoothing the edges of her tattered dress. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, yet unshakably certain. "She visits me in my dreams." A chill rippled down Jonathan's spine despite the mild October day. "She tells me stories," the girl continued, "about you." Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. This was absurd, impossible. A child he had never met, a child who, by all accounts, should have no connection to his mother, was standing before him, speaking with eerie certainty about things that defied logic. He swallowed, trying to maintain his composure. "What's your name?" "Lily." Jonathan's chest tightened. Lily, like the flowers he had placed at the grave, like the name his mother had whispered to him once, long ago, when he was just a boy. He forced himself to remain steady. "Where are your parents, Lily?" A shadow crossed the girl's face. "My mom went to heaven last year." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "And your father?" "He tries," she said quietly, "but it's hard." Jonathan scanned the cemetery, searching for signs of an adult nearby, but there was no one, just the whisper of the wind and the distant rustling of leaves. Did you come here alone? He asked. Lily nodded. We live in the apartments across from the cemetery. Dad works a lot. Today he's at the factory until late. I come here sometimes to talk to the angels. Jonathan had spent his entire life grounded in logic, in strategy, in numbers and calculated risks. Yet something about this girl, about her presence, her words, her unwavering belief in something beyond explanation, made his carefully constructed world feel unsteady beneath him. What stories does my mother tell you? He asked, barely recognizing his own voice. Lily's face brightened. She talks about when you were little, how you used to build towers out of blocks, but you'd get so mad when they fell that you wouldn't try again. She said that changed when you were 6, and you finally built one taller than your head. Jonathan's breath caught. It was true, a memory buried so deep he had nearly forgotten it himself. His mother had always called that day the moment he learned perseverance, the moment he decided he would never stop building. But it wasn't something in any interview. It wasn't in any biography or public record. Lily continued, her voice unwavering. She also said you're lonely in your tower now, that you build and build, but you forgot why you started. Jonathan felt something inside him crack. The cemetery grew impossibly still. Slowly he lowered himself onto the grass, no longer caring that his $1,000 suit was touching the earth. What else did she say? He asked. Lily reached into her tattered backpack and pulled out something small, something old and tarnished. A silver locket. Jonathan's breath hitched as she placed it in his palm. It had been his mother's. Lost the day she died. Gone for 10 years. His hands trembled as he turned it over, finding the familiar engraving on the back, the Sterling family crest. She said you'd say this is impossible, Lily murmured, watching him carefully. But it's not. Jonathan's world tilted. He had spent his entire life believing in things that could be measured, analyzed, and controlled. But this defied all reason. And for the first time in a decade, Jonathan Sterling, the man who had conquered industries and built an empire, felt like nothing more than a boy, sitting before his mother's grave, questioning everything he thought he knew. The cold October wind swept through the cemetery, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth as Jonathan Sterling stood before his mother's grave. The polished marble reflected the overcast sky, a silent monument to the only person who had ever truly seen him. Not as a billionaire, not as a ruthless CEO, but as a boy who once held her hand and believed in dreams. The world knew Jonathan as a man of precision, a man who turned failing businesses into financial empires with the flick of his pen. He was cold, calculating, qualities that had made him one of the most powerful men in the world. But here, in the quiet stillness of Eleanor Sterling's final resting place, he was just a son mourning the 10 years that had passed without her. He bent down, his chest tightening, as he placed a bouquet of white lilies at the base of the headstone, her favorite. The delicate petals were stark against the somber stone, as if fragile things did not belong in a world so harsh. Then he saw her, a child. She was small, barely 7, huddled just beyond his mother's grave. Her dress, once blue, now a washed-out gray, hung loose on her tiny frame. Wild strands of auburn hair whipped around her face, tangled and unkempt. She clutched something in her small hands, a single wildflower, its stem slightly bent, petals trembling in the breeze. Jonathan's first thought was that she was lost. His second was that she didn't belong here. Hello? His voice, deep and commanding in boardrooms, sounded hesitant here. The girl lifted her gaze and Jonathan froze. Her eyes, deep brown, impossibly knowing, locked onto his, unblinking, unwavering. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that did not belong to a child. "You're her son," she said softly. Jonathan's pulse spiked. There was no hesitation in her voice, no curiosity, no uncertainty. It was not a question. "Yes," he said carefully. "I am." She nodded as if confirming something for herself. Then, just as calmly, she said, "She told me to wait for you." Jonathan's breath caught. "What?" "In my dreams," the girl explained, tilting her head. "Your mother visits me in my dreams." A shiver ran down Jonathan's spine. There was something unsettling in her certainty, something unnatural about the way she spoke, as if she had lived a lifetime longer than her 7 years. His throat tightened. My mother? The girl nodded. She said you'd come today. She said I should wait. Jonathan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe. This was ridiculous, impossible, some kind of misunderstanding. What's your name? He asked, his voice rough. Lily, she answered, his fingers curled into fists. Lily, the very name of the flowers he had just placed at his mother's grave. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Where are your parents? He pressed. Lily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the wildflower. My mom went to heaven last year. Jonathan's chest ached in a way he hadn't expected. I see, he said quietly. And your father? She looked away. He tries, she murmured. But it's hard. Jonathan studied her closely, the way her shoulders curled inward, the way her shoes, frayed at the edges, too small for her feet, scuffed against the damp ground. She wasn't just alone here. She was alone in the world. Jonathan glanced around, searching for an adult, someone who might have brought her here. But the cemetery was empty except for an elderly groundskeeper tending to a row of headstones in the distance. How did you get here? He asked, concern creeping into his voice. We live across the street, she said simply. Dad's at work. Alone, a 7-year-old, alone in a cemetery, talking about dreams visits from his dead mother. Jonathan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. This was absurd, impossible. And yet, what did she say? He found himself asking. My mother, in your dreams. Lily's face brightened. She tells me stories. Jonathan's breath hitched. What kind of stories? She smiled faintly, shifting her small frame against the grass. About you, when you were little. A hollow laugh escaped his throat. Oh, really? She nodded. She said you used to build towers with blocks, but when they fell, you'd get so mad that you wouldn't try again. Jonathan felt something deep in his chest crack open. His mind reeled. That memory was buried, so far back in his childhood that even he had almost forgotten. His mother had always loved telling that story, always called it the moment he learned perseverance. But it wasn't in any interview, not in any book or article about his life. Lily shouldn't have known. She said that changed when you were 6, the girl continued, watching him carefully. When you built one taller than your head. His throat tightened. She said after that, you never stopped building. Jonathan couldn't move. It was true. That had been the moment. The exact moment when he had fallen in love with creating, when he had first decided that he wanted to build something bigger than himself. The wind stirred around them, rattling the crisp leaves in the trees, whispering through the cemetery like ghosts sighing between the stones. She also said, Lily hesitated, glancing at the grave, that you're lonely in your tower now. Jonathan's stomach twisted. That you build and build, Lily said, her voice soft, but you forgot why you started. The words sliced through him like a knife. The cemetery was impossibly still. Lily studied him with those impossibly old eyes, as if seeing something in him that he himself could not. Jonathan lowered himself to the ground, suddenly uncaring about his $1,000 suit pressing against the earth. What else did she say? His voice was barely a whisper. Lily reached into her worn backpack. Jonathan's pulse hammered in his ears as she pulled something out. Something small, something old. A silver locket. His breath stalled. No, no, it couldn't be. His hands shook as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the tarnished metal. Slowly he turned it over. The Sterling family crest was engraved on the back. Jonathan's entire world tilted. This locket had been his mother's. She had been wearing it the day she died, and it had never been found. I found it, Lily murmured, buried in the flower bed near the angel statue last month. Jonathan could barely breathe. He had spent 10 years wondering, 10 years aching, 10 years convinced that the locket had simply been lost in the chaos of the hospital, and now it was in her hands. She said to give it to you, Lily whispered, and to tell you, remember the promise under the willow tree. Jonathan's heart stopped. The words hit him like a wrecking ball. No one else had been there. No one else had heard his mother whisper those exact words on her deathbed, gripping his hand with failing strength. No one. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Remember the promise under the willow tree, Jonathan? He had dismissed it as a fevered delusion, a fragment of a mind slipping away. But now a 7-year-old girl he had never met was repeating them to him. His carefully constructed world, the world of logic, of profit and loss, of numbers and acquisitions, collapsed. He stared at the locket in his trembling hands, the weight of it heavier than anything he had ever held. Who was this girl? How could she know things no one should know? And most terrifying of all, what would happen if he believed her? The air was too still. Jonathan Sterling sat frozen in place, the cool weight of the silver locket pressing into his palm like a ghostly touch. The wind rustled the trees, sending dry leaves swirling over the grave, but all he could hear was the rapid pounding of his heart in his ears. He had spent 10 years searching for this locket, 10 years wondering where it had gone, convinced it had been lost in the chaos of the hospital, the frantic calls, the beeping machines, the cold finality of the doctor's words. "We did everything we could, Mr. Sterling. I'm so sorry." That moment was seared into his mind. The last time he saw his mother, Eleanor Sterling, the woman who had shaped him, who had made him who he was. He had been there in her final hours, held her fragile hand in his own, but when her personal belongings had been returned, the locket had been missing. His mother never took it off. It was the only heirloom she had carried from her own childhood, a silver pendant engraved with the Sterling family crest, containing an old, faded photograph of her parents. She had worn it on her wedding day, on the day she gave birth to him, on the last day she was alive, and yet it had vanished. Now, 10 years later, a girl who had no connection to him, no reason to be here, had just placed it into his trembling hands. He stared at Lily, his vision swimming as she sat on the grass, watching him with those impossibly wise brown eyes. She wasn't afraid. She said you'd say this is impossible. Jonathan inhaled sharply, struggling to steady his breathing. Who gave this to you? He rasped. Lily tilted her head as if confused by the question. Your mom did. A chill ran through him, icy and unforgiving. That's not possible. She told me where to find it, Lily corrected herself. She told me in a dream. She said it was buried in the flower bed near the angel statue. Jonathan gripped the locket tighter, as if the pressure of his fingers could anchor him back to reality. His mind raced, searching for explanations. Someone must have taken it from the hospital. Maybe a nurse, a thief, or someone looking for valuables. But why would they bury it? And how could a 7-year-old child possibly know it was there? Lily's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. She also said to tell you, remember the promise under the willow tree. Jonathan's body stiffened. The world around him faded, the cemetery dissolving into nothingness as a memory he had long buried surged to the surface. He was 10 years old, sitting beneath the great willow tree in their family's first home, back when life was simple, before his father's wealth had catapulted them into a world of business, power, and expectations. His mother sat beside him on the cool grass, her long brown hair pinned back, her soft green dress swaying in the summer breeze. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was strong. Strong in ways his father never was. She took his small hands in hers and squeezed them gently. Money is just a tool, Jonathan, she had told him that day. It can build or destroy. It can make the world better, or it can consume you. He had listened carefully because his mother never spoke without purpose. Promise me, she whispered, that whatever you build, whatever empire you create, you will use it for something more than just wealth. Jonathan, full of childhood innocence, had nodded eagerly. I promise, Mama. She smiled, brushing his hair back from his face. Good, because power without purpose is a prison. For years, that moment had been a guiding light. And then he had forgotten. He had broken his promise. Jonathan's hands clenched around the locket, his entire body rigid. The willow tree had been real. The promise had been real, and he had failed her. He had spent years chasing wealth, expanding his company, sitting at the top of the world's financial elite. But what had he actually done with it? Had he built, or had he simply hoarded? His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Power without purpose is a prison. Lily's small fingers brushed his hand. She wants you to remember, she said softly. Jonathan exhaled shakily, his body suddenly exhausted. He had spent so long convincing himself that money was the only thing that mattered. He had justified his ruthless business decisions by telling himself that he was providing jobs, that wealth in itself was enough of a contribution. But had it been, or had he been running running from the past, running from her, running from the guilt of forgetting. He looked at Lily again, really looked at her. A child, no more than 7, dressed in clothes that had seen too many wash cycles, wearing shoes that didn't fit. A girl who had lost her mother, whose father was struggling to keep them afloat. She had nothing, but she still found time to bring wildflowers to a stranger's grave. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. How had he become so blind? Lily shifted on the grass. Are you mad at her? Jonathan blinked. What? For telling me to find you. Something inside him cracked. He reached out, gently tucking a stray curl behind Lily's ear. No, he whispered. I could never be mad at her. Lily smiled, content with his answer. Jonathan took a deep breath, the weight of the silver locket pressing into his palm like an unspoken command. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about what she had left behind, about the people he had ignored, about the promise he had made beneath that willow tree all those years ago. It was time. Time to remember. Time to change. Time to do something that actually mattered. He took Lily's hand in his own and stood, his resolve hardening. Come on, he said gently. Let's get you home. And as they walked away from the grave, away from who he had been, Jonathan Sterling knew that this moment, this chance, this little girl, had just altered the course of his life forever. The walk back to Lily's home was silent. Jonathan Sterling had never felt so out of place in his life. The little girl beside him, small, fragile, yet impossibly strong, walked with quiet confidence, her tiny hand wrapped in his much larger one. She didn't seem to notice the way his grip tightened slightly every now and then, as if grounding himself, as if bracing for something he wasn't prepared to see. The neighborhood they entered stood in stark contrast to the life Jonathan knew. The pristine skyscrapers, polished marble floors, and crystal chandeliers of his world had nothing in common with the crumbling apartment buildings that loomed ahead. The paint on the walls had long since begun to peel, exposing patches of weathered brick. The windows, many of them cracked or covered with old newspapers, seemed to stare back at him like hollowed-out eyes. A sour scent of mildew clung to the damp stairwell as they entered, mixing with something greasy, burnt cooking oil maybe. Jonathan had never stepped foot in a place like this. His wealth had always kept him far from such realities. Yet, as he looked down at Lily, her expression remained unchanged. This wasn't shocking to her. This was her normal. The thought made something deep in his chest twist painfully. Lily led him up the narrow, creaking staircase to the 3rd floor, pausing at the door labeled 3B. The numbers were faded, barely hanging on. Jonathan reached out instinctively, pressing a hand against the frame. It wobbled slightly. The entire door was unstable. A breath left his lips, slow and measured. Is your dad home yet? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. Lily shook her head. He won't be back till late. Factory shifts. Jonathan nodded absently, though he wasn't sure what to say. Lily reached into her backpack and pulled out a key on a frayed string, threading it into the lock. The door opened with a heavy groan, revealing an apartment that was painfully small, barely enough space to fit the essentials. Jonathan stepped inside, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was intruding. The apartment was clean, meticulously so, but there was no denying the signs of struggle. The couch was threadbare, its fabric patched in places where stuffing peeked through. The kitchen counters were bare, except for a small stack of dishes drying next to the sink. A single light flickered in the corner, its dull glow casting shadows against the walls. There were no expensive decorations, no luxuries, just the necessities, and even those looked fragile, as if they could be taken away at any moment. But what stood out to Jonathan the most were the photos, taped along the fridge, pinned to the wall near a small wooden desk. Images of Lily, her father, and a woman he didn't recognize, her mother. Jonathan stepped closer, his gaze tracing over the images. The woman in the photos had the same auburn hair as Lily, the same warm smile. Some pictures showed her healthy, laughing, holding Lily close. Others were more difficult to look at. Hospital gowns, a frail frame, a brave but exhausted expression. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. Lily's mother had been sick, and it was clear they had spent everything trying to save her. Jonathan swallowed hard, a strange pressure building behind his eyes. Lily, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him, placed her backpack down and kicked off her shoes. I can make mac and cheese, she announced cheerfully, already moving toward the tiny kitchen. I know how, 'cause Dad's always tired. Jonathan's jaw clenched. A 7-year-old should not have to learn to cook because her father works himself into exhaustion. A 7-year-old should not have to spend hours alone in an empty apartment. A 7-year-old should not have to visit cemeteries to talk to angels. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply through his nose. Then, stepping forward, he crouched beside Lily as she attempted to reach for a battered pot on the stove. I've got it, he said, his voice softer than usual. Lily blinked, watching as he carefully took the pot down and set it on the burner. You know how to make mac and cheese? She asked, skeptical. A small, almost broken chuckle left him. Not well, he admitted, but I can learn. Lily grinned. For the next few minutes, Jonathan, a billionaire, a man who had built financial empires and dictated global markets, stood in a tiny kitchen, boiling pasta while a 7-year-old supervised. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he was doing something real, something that mattered. The sound of keys rattling at the door snapped Jonathan from his thoughts. A moment later, the door swung open, and a tall, tired-looking man stepped inside. His clothes were stained with factory grease, his boots worn from too many shifts. His face, young yet lined with exhaustion, froze the moment he saw Jonathan standing in his kitchen. A stranger, in his home. What the hell? Before Jonathan could speak, Lily rushed forward. Dad, this is Mr. Sterling. Yeah, Jason Hayes, the man who had fought for everything, who had worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, stood rigid, his gaze locked onto Jonathan, his hands tightening into fists. Sterling? He echoed, eyes darkening. As in Sterling Global? Jonathan hesitated, sensing the resentment beneath the exhaustion. Yeah, he admitted. Jason's jaw ticked. Why the hell is a billionaire in my apartment? Jonathan started to answer, but Lily spoke first. He's Mom's friend. Jason blinked, thrown off course. What? She knew his mom. They were both angels. Silence. Jason's rough, calloused hand ran through his disheveled hair as he exhaled, shaking his head. His entire body looked worn, as if life itself had beaten him down, yet he kept standing because he had no other choice. Jonathan recognized that look. He had seen it in war veterans, in struggling single parents, in people who had been given every reason to quit, but hadn't. She talks about your mother, Jason admitted, rubbing his face. I always thought it was just something she made up to cope after losing Sarah. Jonathan said nothing, his gaze falling to Lily, who stood quietly at her father's side. She wasn't coping. She was carrying the weight of an entire world she shouldn't have to bear. Jonathan exhaled, the decision already forming in his mind. Mr. Hayes, he said slowly, I want to help. Jason's expression hardened. We don't take charity. Jonathan nodded, expecting the response. It's not charity, he said simply. It's a promise, but to be fun. Jason frowned. What? Jonathan turned to Lily, watching as she traced invisible patterns on the floor with her foot. A mother who had given everything. A father who had nothing left to give. A little girl who still had hope, despite it all. Jonathan had power. For years, he had used it for profit. Maybe it was time to use it for people. Tomorrow, Jonathan said, his voice steady, I want you to meet me at my office. Jason hesitated. For what? Jonathan met his gaze. A job. Jason stilled. Jonathan continued. Not a handout, a real job. One that gives you time to actually be here, with her. A long silence filled the room. Then finally, Jason nodded. Lily beamed, and for the first time in 10 years, Jonathan felt like he had kept his promise. If you believe in hope, second chances, and using success to change lives, like this post. If you want to see Jonathan keep his promise and change the lives of those around him, comment below with your support. What would you have done in Jonathan's place? Let's talk. Jonathan Sterling had never been a man who believed in fate. His entire life had been built on numbers, logic, and the unwavering belief that success came to those who fought for it, not those who waited for miracles. He had clawed his way to the top, built an empire with his own 2 hands, and convinced himself that the past was irrelevant. But now, as he sat in his penthouse office, staring at the box of forgotten documents he had found at his mother's estate, Jonathan felt something he hadn't in years. Doubt. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over the worn edges of the wooden box. The papers inside were old, yellowed with time, yet carefully preserved. Letters, financial reports, and handwritten notes in his mother's delicate cursive. At first glance, they were just documents. But the more he read, the more he realized they were pieces of something much bigger. A history he had buried, a legacy he had ignored, a connection he was only now beginning to understand. Among the records was a name he hadn't seen in years, the Eleanor Sterling Children's Fund. Jonathan frowned, his mind racing. His mother had started the foundation decades ago, long before she became the wife of a billionaire, long before she was known for her philanthropy. She had always believed in helping children in need, in giving them access to education, medical care, and a future beyond poverty. Jonathan remembered hearing about it as a child, how she would spend hours at community centers, how she would write letters to hospitals, fighting to secure funding for pediatric treatments. But when she died, when he took over the company, the foundation had been dissolved. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but because he had been too focused on growing the empire to care about the details of what got lost in the process. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the edges of an old financial report. His board had argued that the foundation was bleeding money, that it wasn't efficient, that they could repurpose the funds for broader corporate philanthropy. And he had agreed. He had been too distracted, too focused on profit margins and international acquisitions to fight for something that wasn't necessary for business. It had been just another number on a balance sheet, another thing he had let go. Now, staring at the documents before him, Jonathan realized what that decision had cost. Because in those reports, in the grants, in the letters, in the handwritten notes, was a name that stopped his heart. Sarah Hayes. Jonathan stood so fast that his chair nearly toppled over. His mind raced as he pulled out a photograph buried beneath the reports. His mother, smiling, kneeling beside a group of children, and next to her a young woman with familiar auburn hair. Sarah, Lily's mother. Jonathan's breath hitched. His mother had known her. She had worked with her, helped her. He grabbed the nearest letter, scanning the words. Sarah Hayes has been an invaluable addition to our volunteer team. Her dedication to the children is inspiring, and her skills in nursing will serve her well in the future. I'm recommending her for the scholarship program. We need more people like her in this world. His mother had mentored Sarah. She had helped her get into nursing school. Jonathan's throat tightened. This wasn't just some coincidence. His mother had helped the woman whose daughter had now led him back to her. And yet, when Sarah had fallen sick, when medical bills had started piling up, where had he been? Where had his company been? The answer hit him like a punch to the gut. Nowhere. Because by then, his mother's foundation was gone. Because he had let it die. Jonathan felt his stomach churn. If the foundation had still existed, if he had paid attention, if he had cared, would Sarah have gotten the treatment she needed? Would she still be alive? Would Lily still have her mother? A sharp, aching guilt spread through his chest, twisting around his ribs like barbed wire. He had spent years convincing himself that his work helped people, that he had built an empire that provided jobs, opportunities, security. But what about the ones he left behind? What about the ones who needed help the most? What about the promise he had made? Promise me, his mother had whispered all those years ago beneath the willow tree, that you will use what you build for something more. He had broken that promise. But maybe it wasn't too late to make things right. Jonathan grabbed his phone, his fingers tightening around the smooth glass. He had made billions from restructuring failing companies. He had built an empire on turning losses into profit. Now he was going to use those skills for something else. The Eleanor Sterling and Children's Fund was coming back, but not as a charity, not as some tax-deductible corporate initiative. No, it was going to be the biggest medical research foundation in the country. And this time, it wasn't going to be just a name on a list of assets. This time, he was going to make sure it mattered. The next morning, Jonathan found himself standing outside St. Clair's Community Center. It was a modest building, old but well-loved. Inside, children laughed, played, and studied at worn wooden desks. This had been one of his mother's projects, a place she had poured her heart into, a place that had once received funding from her foundation, until it had been cut off. And yet, even after all these years they had survived, they had kept going. Jonathan's hands clenched at his sides. Not anymore. He wasn't going to let them struggle. He wasn't going to let them be forgotten again. As he stepped inside, he could feel the weight of his mother's legacy, the presence of everything she had fought for. This was where he belonged. Not just in corporate boardrooms, but here, with them. He pulled out his phone and dialed his COO, Victoria. "Reinstate the Eleanor Sterling Children's Fund," he said, his voice steady, unshakable. There was a pause, then a slow exhale. "Are you sure?" "More than I've ever been." Jonathan Sterling had never known true fear. He had experienced high-stakes risks, billion-dollar deals that could have collapsed under the wrong move, market crashes that sent lesser men into ruin. But he had never felt this. This kind of fear was different. It was raw, suffocating, gripping his chest so tightly that he could barely breathe. Lily lay motionless in the hospital bed, her small hand limp in his own. The pale blue hospital gown dwarfed her tiny frame, her auburn curls falling against the stark white pillow. She looked so fragile, too fragile. His mind replayed the moment over and over, as if torturing him for not acting sooner. One minute she had been fine, laughing, drawing pictures at the community center, her face alight with the kind of joy only children possessed. And then, her body had seized, her eyes rolled back. She had collapsed to the floor, limbs shaking uncontrollably. Someone had screamed. Maybe Jason. Maybe one of the teachers. Jonathan couldn't even remember. All he knew was that he had run to her, his hands trembling as he pulled her into his arms, shouting her name, willing her to wake up. She hadn't. The ambulance ride had been a blur. Sirens wailing, paramedics shouting medical jargon he didn't understand, Jason clutching his head in his hands, crying silently. And now they were here, waiting, helpless. Jason sat in the chair across from him, his elbows on his knees, fingers tangled in his hair. He had barely spoken since they arrived, barely looked up from the floor. Jonathan wanted to say something, anything, but what could he say? "She's going to be okay," Jason mumbled suddenly, his voice hoarse, as if saying it would make it true. "She has to be." Jonathan swallowed against the tightness in his throat. He had spent years convincing himself that money could fix anything. But what if this was the one thing it couldn't? A sharp knock at the door made them both sit up. Dr. Catherine Bennett stepped inside, her face unreadable. She was one of the best neurologists in the country. Jonathan had made sure of that. He had called her personally, pulled every string he had, moved mountains to get her on this case. Because this was Lily, and failure was not an option. She set a file down on the small metal table beside the bed and folded her arms. "Mr. Hayes," she said, looking at Jason first. Then her gaze flickered to Jonathan. "Mr. Sterling." Jonathan's stomach clenched. He recognized that tone. He had heard it before, 10 years ago. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. There's nothing more we can do." "No, not again." Jason straightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of the chair. "Just tell me, please." Dr. Bennett sighed, rubbing her temple. "We've run extensive tests. Lily's condition, it's rare, very rare." Jonathan's jaw locked. "How rare?" Dr. Bennett opened the file, turning it so they could see the brain scans. "This pattern of abnormalities, it's something I've only seen documented once before." She hesitated. Jonathan felt ice rush through his veins. "Who?" he demanded. Dr. Bennett met his gaze. "Your mother." The words felt like a slap. Jason stilled. His eyes flickered between Jonathan and the doctor. "What?" Jonathan gripped the table, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "My mother had this condition?" Dr. Bennett nodded slowly. "Yes, it wasn't widely known. At the time, it was undiagnosed. But I had the privilege of studying her case years ago. She was one of the first documented patients with this particular form of cerebral microbleeds." Jonathan's hands curled into fists. He remembered the way his mother had suffered. The headaches, the memory lapses, the way her body had failed her slowly until she had slipped away entirely. And now, Lily had it too? Jason's breath came out in a choked sob. Is she dying?" Dr. Bennett hesitated. "Not necessarily." Jonathan's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" Dr. Bennett took a deep breath. When your mother was diagnosed, the treatment options were limited, but since then, there have been advancements. In fact, she paused, choosing her next words carefully. Some of those advancements were based on research your mother helped fund. Jonathan's world tilted. His mother's foundation, the research grants, the experimental medical programs she had poured her heart into, programs that had been shut down when he let the foundation dissolve. He felt sick. "What's the survival rate?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Bennett hesitated. "If we intervene now, high, but it's expensive. The procedures, the medication, the long-term care." Jason laughed bitterly. "We don't have that kind of money." Jonathan stood up. And, yes, we do." Jason turned sharply. "What?" Jonathan's heartbeat pounded in his ears, but his mind had never been clearer. "We'll do the treatment," he said. "Every single procedure. The best specialists, the best care." Jason shook his head. "Jonathan, No," Jonathan cut in, his voice firm. "There's no debate. Lily gets the best. Period." Jason's lips trembled. For the first time since the diagnosis, his tough exterior cracked. He pressed a hand over his mouth, nodding quickly, his shoulders shaking. Jonathan turned back to Dr. Bennett. "Start now. Whatever she needs, do it." Dr. Bennett gave him a small nod. "I'll make the calls." And just like that, the world shifted. Jonathan sat by Lily's bed for hours. She woke up once, her small fingers tugging weakly at his sleeve. "Mr. Morgan?" she murmured, still half asleep. Jonathan swallowed hard, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart?" She smiled faintly. "Your mom says thank you." His breath hitched, and then she drifted back into sleep. Jonathan turned away, rubbing his face roughly. Jason watched him carefully. "You okay?" Jonathan let out a hollow laugh. "I don't know." Jason sighed. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Jonathan murmured. Jason frowned. "But why? Why are you doing this?" Jonathan turned to face him, his answer coming without hesitation. "Because I could have saved my mother," he said, voice thick with emotion. "And I didn't." Jason stilled. Jonathan exhaled. "I won't make that mistake again." A long silence stretched between them. Then Jason nodded, and for the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he had finally done something that mattered. Jonathan Sterling stood at the top of the Sterling Global Tower, his empire stretching before him in a sea of glittering skyscrapers. From this height, the world below looked small, manageable, insignificant. For years he had believed that this, the power, the wealth, the control, was everything. But now, as he gazed out over the city, he felt none of the pride he once had. All he felt was emptiness, a gnawing, aching kind of emptiness that no amount of success could fill. Because for the first time in 10 years, he saw himself clearly, a man who had spent his life chasing numbers instead of meaning. A man who had built an empire, but had forgotten why he started building in the first place. And for what? To sit in a penthouse office, isolated from the world, to sign contracts, close deals, watch numbers climb higher and higher, only to realize in the end that none of it mattered. Because the only thing that had ever truly mattered was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. And he had almost missed it. Jonathan exhaled, his jaw tightening. He had spent years convincing himself that wealth was the greatest measure of success, but now he knew the truth. The greatest measure of success isn't what you gain, it's what you give. His mother had known that. Lily had known that. And now, finally, so did he. Victoria Pierce, his chief operating officer, stood across from him, her arms folded, her expression carefully neutral. She was the only person in his company who dared to challenge him, who had been by his side for over a decade, navigating corporate wars and boardroom battles. She was brilliant, ruthless when she needed to be, and always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. But even she hadn't expected this. "You're stepping on," she repeated as if she hadn't heard him correctly the first time. Jonathan nodded, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Effective immediately." Victoria stared at him, then let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious." She shook her head, pacing in front of his desk. "Jonathan, you don't just walk away from Sterling Global. This company, your company, is at the peak of its power. The Nakamura merger alone will..." I don't care about the Nakamura merger. Victoria froze. That was when she realized he wasn't just talking about taking a break. He was done. You built this empire, she said, her voice softer now, measured. You fought for it. You sacrificed for it. Are you really going to throw it all away? Jonathan met her gaze, unwavering. I'm not throwing it away, he said. I'm doing something more important. She exhaled, running a hand through her sleek black hair. So this is about the girl. Jonathan's jaw tightened. This is about a promise, one I should have kept years ago. Victoria studied him carefully, her sharp, calculating mind assessing the situation like a chessboard. She had seen Jonathan in every scenario, furious, ruthless, exhausted, triumphant. But she had never seen him this certain. Who's taking over? She finally asked. Jonathan didn't hesitate. You. Victoria blinked. Me? You're the only person I trust to run this company the way it needs to be run. She let out a slow breath. And what about you? What happens after you step down? Jonathan turned toward the window, looking out at the city one last time. I'm going home. 2 weeks later, Jonathan found himself standing in the very place where his life had begun to change. St. Clair's Community Center. The small, run-down building had once been a cornerstone of his mother's foundation. Now it was barely holding together. The paint was peeling, the furniture was old. The classrooms, once filled with children, were quiet. The programs cut back due to lack of funding. Jonathan took a slow breath, his hands tightening into fists. He had let this happen. He had let his mother's dream crumble. But he would fix it. The Eleanor Sterling Children's Fund was coming back, stronger than before. This time, it wouldn't just be a charity. It would be a force of change. Jason Hayes sat across from him, his face still worn with exhaustion. But there was something different in his eyes now, hope. Jonathan had called him here today with an offer, one that would change both of their lives. You want me to run this? Jason asked, his voice quiet but steady. Jonathan nodded. Who else would I trust with it? Jason let out a slow, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. I've spent my whole life just trying to survive. I don't know the first thing about running a foundation. You know more than you think, Jonathan said. You know what it's like to fight, to be on the other side of it, to want to help and not have the resources to do it. Jason swallowed hard. Why me? Jonathan exhaled. Because I need someone who cares. Jason was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. And just like that, the first piece of his mother's legacy was restored. Lily's surgery had been a success. She was still recovering, still needing therapy and observation. But the doctors were hopeful. Jonathan visited her every day, reading to her, telling her stories about his mother. She loved hearing about Eleanor, loved the idea that maybe, just maybe, she had been the one to bring them all together. One evening, as Jonathan was getting ready to leave, Lily reached out, her tiny fingers tugging at his sleeve. He turned, eyebrows raising. Mr. Sterling? She murmured sleepily. He knelt beside her bed. Yeah, sweetheart? She gave him a sleepy, knowing smile. You kept your promise. Jonathan's breath hitched. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then slowly he nodded. Yeah, he whispered. I did. A month later, Jonathan walked through the doors of Sterling Global Tower one last time. He passed by the polished offices, the boardrooms where he had once ruled the world. But now his world was different. He no longer cared about stock prices, about expansions, about global dominance, because he had found something better. As he stepped into the conference room, Victoria stood, waiting. The paperwork's ready, she said. Jonathan nodded, picking up the pen. His signature was steady. As he signed his name, as he stepped down from the company he had built, he felt no regret, only freedom. Because now, for the first time in his entire life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Jonathan Sterling had spent most of his life believing that love was a distraction. He had seen it happen to others, seen powerful men lose themselves in the pursuit of something uncontrollable, unpredictable. He had watched friends trade ambition for affection, watched colleagues make foolish decisions in the name of feelings, and he had promised himself he would never be one of them. Love wasn't efficient, it wasn't calculable. And for a man who built his world on logic and control, love was simply too great a risk. But then he met her. And suddenly everything he thought he knew about power, control, and what truly mattered began to unravel. It started at the hospital. Jonathan had spent weeks there, keeping vigil by Lily's bedside. He had barely left her side, his focus singular, unwavering. And every time he looked up, every time exhaustion threatened to pull him under, Dr. Emma Bennett was there. She was calm, steady, her presence an anchor in the chaos. She spoke with confidence, but not arrogance. She carried grace, but not fragility. And above all else, she cared. Not just about Lily, not just about medicine, but about people. And that was something Jonathan had spent far too long ignoring. At first, their interactions were brief, clinical discussions, medical updates, short conversations in hallways filled with too much tension and not enough sleep. But then came the nights, the long, sleepless nights where Jonathan found himself sitting beside Lily's hospital bed long after visiting hours had ended, staring blankly at the monitors, wondering if she would wake up in the morning. And more often than not, Emma was there too. She would lean against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes soft with something he didn't recognize. "Go home," she would tell him, and he would shake his head. "Not until she's better." Emma never argued. She would simply sigh, pull up a chair beside him and say, "Then I guess I'm staying too." And somehow that was enough. Enough to keep him sane. Enough to remind him that he wasn't alone in this. Enough to make him start noticing things about her he shouldn't. Like the way she chewed on her pen when she was thinking. The way her laugh was warm, effortless. The kind that softened even the hardest of edges. The way she looked at Lily, not just as a patient, but as a little girl with dreams and a future worth fighting for. And for the first time in years, Jonathan realized that maybe, just maybe, he was fighting for more than just Lily. Maybe he was fighting for himself too. It wasn't until after Lily's surgery, after she had woken up, smiled at him, called him Mr. Sterling in that sleepy little voice, that Jonathan finally admitted it to himself. It wasn't just gratitude he felt for Emma. It wasn't just admiration. It was something else, something he had spent his entire life avoiding, but he didn't know how to say it, didn't know if he was even allowed to feel it, not after everything that had happened. And so he did what he had always done best. He ignored it, until she forced him to face it. It was a quiet evening when it happened. Jonathan had spent the day meeting with contractors, rebuilding St. Clair's Community Center, securing funding for his mother's foundation, undoing the damage he had let happen. By the time he arrived at the hospital, Lily was already asleep, her tiny fingers curled around the silver locket he had given back to her. Emma was sitting outside in the waiting area, flipping through paperwork, but she looked up the moment she saw him. "You missed dinner," she said lightly. Jonathan smirked. "Didn't know I had to check in with my doctor now." Emma rolled her eyes. "You've been running around fixing the world, but when's the last time you took care of yourself?" Jonathan hesitated, because the answer was never. Emma sighed, setting her papers aside. "Come on." He raised a brow. "Where?" She grabbed her coat. "You're getting food, and this time you don't get to say no." He didn't argue, and that was how it started. One dinner turned into two. Two turned into nights spent talking about things that had nothing to do with medicine or business. Nights where Jonathan told her about his mother, about the promise he had broken and was now trying to mend. Nights where Emma told him about her past, about how she had spent years watching the people she loved suffer because they couldn't afford the care they needed. Nights where Jonathan realized that Emma wasn't just a doctor, she was a fighter, just like him. And maybe, just maybe, that was why he couldn't stay away. The wind rustled through the branches of the willow tree, sending golden leaves drifting to the ground like tiny pieces of a past he had finally made peace with. Jonathan stood beneath its canopy, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest, not from nerves, but from certainty. He had spent his entire life believing that love was a risk he couldn't afford to take. But now he knew the truth. Some risks were worth everything. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Emma approached slowly, a small smile playing at her lips. "You know, when you invited me here, I wasn't expecting something this sentimental." Jonathan smirked. "What can I say? I'm full of surprises." Emma crossed her arms. "Oh? And what exactly is this surprise?" Jonathan took a deep breath. Then, without hesitation, he dropped to one knee. Emma's breath hitched. For the first time since he had met her, she was speechless. Jonathan reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. I spent years thinking that power and success were the most important things in life, he said quietly. And then I met you, and you showed me that the real power is in saving lives, not just building empires. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. Jonathan looked up at her, his expression unguarded, completely open. I love you, Emma, he admitted, the words falling from his lips like a truth he had been waiting his whole life to say. Emma let out a shaky laugh. You really are full of surprises. Jonathan smirked. So, what do you say? She didn't answer. She just dropped to her knees in front of him, threw her arms around his neck, and whispered, yes. And in that moment, beneath the willow tree where everything had begun, Jonathan Sterling finally found his way home. The air was different here. Crisp, fresh, alive. Jonathan Sterling stood beneath the willow tree, its golden leaves rustling softly in the afternoon breeze. The branches swayed, whispering against each other like quiet voices from the past, carrying words only the heart could hear. It had been exactly 1 year since his life had changed. 1 year since a little girl with wise brown eyes and a wildflower in her hand had shattered the walls around him. 1 year since he had walked away from the empire he built to create something greater. 1 year since he had finally kept his promise. And now, standing in the very place where his journey had begun, Jonathan breathed deeply, feeling a peace he had never known before. Behind him, St. Clair's Community Center stood tall and new, completely rebuilt, no longer a crumbling reminder of what had been lost, but a beacon of hope for what was still to come. Inside, children laughed. Families gathered. Lives were being changed because of him. Not because of his money, not because of his power, but because he had chosen to care. Jason Hayes stood nearby, watching the children play in the courtyard, his arms folded over his chest. The deep lines of exhaustion that once carved his face had softened. He was no longer just a father fighting to survive. He was a leader. A man who had gone from working 3 jobs just to keep food on the table to running one of the most impactful community programs in the city. Jason turned to Jonathan, shaking his head with a small laugh. You know, a year ago, if someone had told me I'd be here, doing this, I would have called them crazy. Jonathan smirked. Yeah, well, a year ago, if someone had told me a 7-year-old would completely change my life, I would have done the same. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. Lily has that effect on people. As if on cue, Lily's laughter rang through the air, bright and full of life, as she ran barefoot through the grass, chasing butterflies. She was healthy now, strong, alive. The girl who had once spent her afternoons alone in a cemetery, speaking to angels, was now surrounded by people who loved her, protected her, and fought for her. Jason exhaled, watching her with the kind of gratitude that only a father who had nearly lost everything could understand. I don't think I ever said it properly, he murmured. Jonathan turned. Said what? Jason swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Jonathan's throat tightened, but he only nodded, clapping Jason on the shoulder. You would have done the same. Jason laughed softly. Yeah, but I couldn't have. Jonathan met his gaze. You can now. And that was all that mattered. Not far from them, Dr. Emma Bennett sat on a wooden bench, a medical journal resting open in her lap. Jonathan smirked, watching as she chewed absent-mindedly on the end of her pen, a habit that had become strangely endearing. She caught him staring and raised a brow. What? Jonathan shook his head, smirking. Nothing, just thinking. Emma rolled her eyes. That's never a good sign. Jonathan chuckled, making his way toward her. He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. For once it is. Emma smiled, tilting her face up toward him. Oh, and what's on your mind, Mr. Sterling? Jonathan slid onto the bench beside her, his fingers lacing through hers. This, he murmured, glancing around. The community center. The children playing, the families laughing. The life he had built, not for himself but for others. Emma squeezed his hand gently. It suits you, you know, being happy. Jonathan smirked. I had a good teacher. She arched a brow. Lily, Jonathan chuckled. Both of you. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. I think your mom would be proud. Jonathan exhaled slowly, letting the words settle deep in his chest. I hope so, he whispered. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden light over the courtyard, making the willow tree glow. Jonathan stood beneath it, watching as the leaves swayed in the soft autumn breeze. And then, for just a moment, the wind shifted. It wasn't much, just a whisper, a sound barely there. But Jonathan felt it, a warmth at his back, a presence, a feeling of something or someone standing with him. And then, like a laugh carried through the wind, he heard it. I am proud of you, my love. Jonathan's breath caught. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. He swallowed hard, closing his eyes. It could have been his imagination. It could have been nothing at all. But in that moment, standing beneath the tree where his mother had once made him promise to do something greater than himself, Jonathan believed. And as he opened his eyes, he found Lily standing just a few feet away, watching him. She smiled, that small, knowing smile, the kind that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, she knew something he didn't. Jonathan smirked. You hear it too, don't you? Lily shrugged, twirling in the grass. I hear a lot of things. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. And as he walked toward her, as she took his hand without hesitation, he realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Jonathan's journey isn't just a story about power and redemption. It's a story about what truly matters in life. Money doesn't make a man great. His actions do. Success is not about how much you have, but how much you give. Sometimes the people who need us the most aren't the ones in our world, but the ones we never expected to meet. Jonathan could have spent his life chasing wealth, deals, acquisitions, and power, but he learned that the greatest success was in keeping a promise, changing a life, and choosing love over ambition. And if there's one thing we can all take from this story, it's this. Find your purpose. Live for something bigger than yourself. And never forget, what we leave behind is not our money, but our impact. Did you love Jonathan's journey? What was your favorite moment? Comment below and let's talk. If you believe in second chances and using wealth and power for good, like this story, don't miss out on more powerful emotional stories. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for new stories every week. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes the right story at the right time can change everything. Would you have walked away from power for something greater? What would you do if you had the chance to change lives? Let's talk.